Hello and welcome to Across the Pond, a podcast program prepared by the communications team of CIWA, the Cooperation in International Waters in Africa. My name is Karine Drought. In this new episode, we invite you to learn more about what we can do to protect biodiversity through transboundary solutions in Africa. What is biodiversity? Why is it important? What is SADRI, the Southern Africa Drought Resilience Initiative, supported by CIWA? Sarah Moyer, our CIWA environmental specialist, gives us some answers. Jungville, our comms specialist, is leading the conversation.
Welcome to the Across the Pond podcast. Today, we would like to focus on one of the Cooperation in International Waters in Africa's, or CIWA's, most important strategic areas, biodiversity. Our guest today is Sarah Moyer, a senior environmental specialist at CIWA and the World Bank. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Sarah, please tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you develop an interest in biodiversity, the subject of today's podcast? And how does biodiversity align with your values in protecting the planet?
Oh, it's a great question. It really stems, frankly, from a lifelong interest. I come from the state of Colorado in the United States, so I grew up in the Rocky Mountains, had a lot of exposure to the natural environment. And one particular person in my life, a teacher in primary school, had a big impact. She had organized her curriculum, the entire curriculum, around the interaction between humans and Earth. And it really had a lasting impact on me. We would say a pledge to the planet each morning. And I think it kind of gave us a mindset for always thinking about how things interact. And as I grew up, I kept that and I carried it over into my studies and into my work. I studied natural resources management and political economy. I started off studying and focusing on energy systems, and that quickly transitioned into climate change. And it's really not possible to focus on climate change in a comprehensive way without looking at the cross-sectoral relationships between water, land, air, flora, and fauna. It's all connected.
Biodiversity is a commonly used term. Could you briefly summarize what exactly is biodiversity and why it's so important?
Yeah, so biodiversity refers to the variety of life on Earth, so the variety of plants and animals. You could think of it as literally the spice of life. When we talk about biodiversity, we generally talk about it from three different levels. So we look at the biodiversity at the genetic, species, and ecosystem or habitat level. And it really just sort of emphasizes the fact that it encompasses all of life and the interaction between all of life on the planet.
I mentioned earlier that the Cooperation in International Waters in Africa avidly supports biodiversity in its program. But how is biodiversity linked to Transboundary Waters Cooperation?
When we think about ways in which we want to support or conserve biodiversity, one of the areas that we start with is thinking about water. And so these two things go hand in hand, especially in the region in which I live, which is in Southern Africa. You see this link quite directly because biodiversity plays such an important role in the local economies. And water is already a limited resource that has to be well managed and well preserved.
Sarah, you've spoken about why biodiversity is important as a global system. Can you speak specifically about its importance to the region in which you work? And what does Southern Africa stand to lose if it loses its biodiversity?
Yes. Biodiversity is really critical to this region, Southern Africa, and you can think about it along a couple of different lines. So at the national economic level, biodiversity contributes quite significantly to the bottom line, to a country's GDP. And we can look at this through the lens of something, for example, tourism, eco-based tourism, the safaris, the bird watching. Many of the countries in Southern Africa draw a significant portion of their GDP from tourist activities. And those tourist activities are directly related to the strength and health of the biodiversity of those countries. But it's also incredibly important at a more local level, at the livelihood level. This is also a region that has a significant level of poverty, and many people get their basic services directly from their environments, from their natural environments. So this is things like food, medicine, water, fuel in the form of firewood, for example. If you break down the biodiversity in these regions, you're literally hurting livelihoods. You're hurting the bottom lines of individuals who are living in this region.
Very good. Now on to our next question. Tell us a little bit more about biodiversity's role in building climate resilience.
Yeah, so there is a strong link between the health of the biodiversity in a community or a region and the natural climate resilience that exists there. So in general, when your biodiversity is in balance, your infrastructure, your ecological infrastructure is going to be much healthier. So ecological infrastructure is just a fancy way of talking about things like wetlands or mountain catchment. Or something like a coastal dune. These are things that naturally defend well against climatic shocks, such as a drought, such as flooding. And when those things break down, a community becomes more vulnerable. So by investing in biodiversity, by protecting it and conserving it, you're actually strengthening the planet's natural ability to withstand climatic shocks and weather events. And while, as these events get more and more intense, the need for that is higher and higher.
I understand you work on the Southern Africa Drought Resilience Initiative, or SADRI, a CIWA-supported program. Can you speak a little bit about the goals of this initiative and your specific role?
Sure. So SADRI, or Southern African Drought Resilience Initiative, is a program that is aimed at strengthening analysis and institutions around integrated drought management, and in being able to better attract investment in integrated drought management tools. So when we talk about integrated drought management, we're talking about systems that are in place to monitor drought and provide early warnings of it, to help us understand the vulnerability and risk of drought, and finally to focus and invest on preparation, mitigation, and response. So this initiative is something that is focused specifically in the Southern African region. We apply SADRI through the lens of the relationship between drought and cities, drought and energy, drought and agriculture, and then drought and livelihoods. And this particular piece, drought and livelihoods, is one where I've been working the most closely. We are focused on identifying communities that are particularly prone to drought, that are least equipped to withstand the shock of it, and to find ways to help them improve their resilience to it. To start, we have chosen to look in a very special kind of community, a Transfrontier Conservation Area, a TFCA. And TFCAs essentially are transboundary, so they're international by definition, and it's an approach to managing an entire ecosystem. So instead of drawing the line around a national boundary, you're drawing a boundary around a natural ecosystem and looking at ways of managing it in a regional way. So we are focused on the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. That area includes the countries of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. And we're focused on helping to fill analytical gaps around the understanding of water usage, the demand for water, its availability, and probably most importantly, its governance or lack of governance. To provide recommendations to strengthen the use of water in those areas and make those communities more resilient.
And what was the reason behind the creation of the Southern Africa Drought Resilience Initiative?
Yeah, so there's really two reasons. One is that drought is the most deadly and costly natural disaster in Southern Africa. Drought affects more people and causes more deaths in the region than anything else. And the other reason is that this region is particularly vulnerable to drought, and climate change is making drought a lot worse. So when we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about both the frequency and the intensity of drought hitting a region or a community. So how often is it happening and how bad is it happening? But we also talk about vulnerability through the lens of how equipped or ill-equipped is a country or a community to withstand that shock. And when both of those things are when there's a high vulnerability of both of those things, it really is, it puts a lot of lives at risk. And so the Southern Africa Drought Resilience Initiative was created to provide tools to countries that they could use to better implement and coordinate drought resilience strategies, and to try and do this across borders and also across sectors.
Biodiversity, like water, is transboundary in nature. How does that make protecting biodiversity easier? And how does it make it more challenging?
Oh, I love this question. Yeah, I think, a good way to think about this is to just start by noting that in general, management approaches that respect the actual boundary of the natural resource are the best approaches. So whether that natural resource is water or whether that natural resource is biodiversity, if you can find a way to respect the actual natural boundary, that's the best approach, but it's not the easiest. So herein lies both the advantage and the challenge of a transboundary approach to supporting something like biodiversity. You can think, for example, of a population of elephants. Regional approaches are advantageous because they put more eyes on the issue. And that can often be a really important aid to attract resources and also to bring a higher level of political support, because by nature they're cross-country, and so they're going to require some kind of cross-country agreement to be in place, whether that's a treaty or some other agreement. But they're also challenging because working across countries means you need to find ways to align policies or regulations. You might even have to alignment in cultural values. Decisions have to be made about how costs will be shared. And sometimes these hurdles are difficult or even impossible to overcome. But generally, if both sides can see the benefit of cooperation and how that outweighs the costs, then a regional approach can be set up to be successful.
There's also a gender aspect to biodiversity management, very similar to water resources management. Can you speak about that and the role of gender in the way that CIWA and the World Bank approach biodiversity management?
We do see gender as an aspect of biodiversity management, but this really is a result of the way that traditional natural resource management has taken place historically. So it tends to be, it's not always, but in many communities and societies, it tends to be a male-dominated area. Natural resources in general, the decisions about them, how they're consumed, how they're utilized, we often see an absence of women at the table for those decisions. But of course, women are active participants in the use of natural resources, including water, including biodiversity. They're often the caretakers of it as well, the custodians of it. And in general, as we really come to understand the need to sort of reconnect humans with their natural environments, this really has to apply to everyone. And in order for us to have solutions that work for everyone, we need to have women at the table as well. So this is a work in progress. This is something that takes practice to really stop and think and ensure that we've consulted with everyone, that we've given them space to participate and contribute their ideas for both what isn't working and what could work better. One of the ways that the World Bank does this, or specifically one of the ways that CIWA does this, is to ensure that gender and social inclusion is mainstreamed throughout its activities. And it has a gender and social inclusion framework to help make this possible. And this really comes down to ensuring that there is time and space dedicated to this issue, that you have the technical expertise on teams who are paying attention to it, and that you listen to communities and you hear what they have to say. But it is important, and I think for the long-term health of biodiversity, the management of natural resources in general, we really can't do that without the voice of women at the table.
Thank you, Sarah, for being with us here today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Listeners, we have been speaking with Sarah Moyer on CIWA's work to understand and leverage water's role in relationship to nature. We hope this discussion has been informative to you and that you have learned how biodiversity is a top priority on CIWA's agenda and allow the program to robustly support long-term conservation programs. Until next time, we bid you goodbye.